So today I'm going to argue that God does not exist. And I'm arguing that God does not exist because of the amount of pain and suffering that exists in the world. So in the first segment, I'm going to walk us through the argument that God does not exist. This is known as the argument from suffering. And then in the following three segments, I'm going to explain why God might allow for the suffering that we endure. The first idea is because the suffering allows us to appreciate the good things we have. The second idea is that the suffering is necessary for us to acquire valuable character traits. And the third alternative is that God permits the suffering because it allows us to have free will. And then finally, we will consider a response that God has his hidden reasons for allowing the suffering, but they're just things that we can't possibly comprehend. So the chapter starts with a little thought experiment. This is the idea of Narnia. This is supposed to be some other country or some other place, and in that place it's supposed to be very lively and energetic, and the people are all happy. There's a lot of skyscrapers. It's a very productive society. But at the same time, the world is filled with a lot of inequalities. There's a lot of suffering, and there's a lot of people who aren't experiencing all the benefits that Narnia has to offer. And so while you're there, you're on a tour, and the tour guide tells you that there is this ruler of Narnia, and the ruler is supposed to be all-powerful, all-loving, and all-knowing. Now it's okay, is that really consistent? This idea of these major inequalities, these major injustices, and the idea of an all-powerful and all-loving and all-knowing God. Would you really believe that that ruler is there? Would you really believe that they have all those powers that they have? Are these two ideas consistent? Can they both actually be true at the same time? God being all-powerful and all-loving, and there being this suffering and inequality in the world. Okay, so now that you think about Narnia like that, the idea is supposed to be okay, well, how different is the actual world? Suppose that you're told that there's an all-powerful, all-loving God who is in control of this world. And then so think about the same questions. Is that consistent? Is that, the idea that there is these inequalities and suffering in the world, and that there's an all-powerful God? Can both of those ideas be true at the same time, not just in Narnia, but actually in the real world here? All right, so now let's turn to the argument from suffering. So the argument from suffering says that AS1, there is suffering in the world. AS2, if there is suffering in the world, then God does not exist. AS3, so God does not exist. All right, so before we can go and break down that argument, first we need to talk about some of the definitions. So suffering here is being defined as any pain or discomfort that living beings endure, large or small, physical or emotional. So then God, also we need to be clear, we're not just using God in any kind of religious sense. We're actually using God in a very specific kind of religious sense. So there's a couple religions who have this thought of God in mind, and they're, usually Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, where the God is all-powerful, all-loving, and all-knowing. So that's omnibenevolent, that means all good, all-loving. Omniscient, that means all-knowing. And omnipotent, that means all-powerful. And so we call these three parts of God, when they're together in one God, we call that an omni-being. So anytime I'm using the word God in this video, what I mean is an omni-being. So the Hindu gods, or Buddha's not really a god, but the gods in other religions outside of the three I was mentioning, they might have gods that are imperfect. And so that's not the kind of God that we are going for here. That's not the kind of God that is going to be affected by an argument like this. Okay, so now that we have those definitions down, let's talk about the premises. Okay, so the first premise, AS1, is pretty uncontroversial. Even if you've had a pretty smooth life so far, you could probably still fill an entire book worth of all the pain and suffering that you've had in your life. So AS2 is the premise that, if there is an omni-being, then that being would stop all the pain in the world. But since there is pain and suffering in the world, then we should think that there must not be an omni-being that exists. So again, imperfect beings are not what we're talking about here. An imperfect being might not be able to control all of the things in the world, or they might not know that there's suffering in the world, or they might not actually care. Maybe not all gods really love all people or all living beings. So if you're thinking of a god that is one of those three, like that's not the kind of god we're talking about here. That god might allow for suffering, and maybe for good reason. So generally there is the response that God allows suffering because there's some sort of greater good that can be obtained by those who have endured the suffering. But what is that greater good that we're getting from experiencing suffering? So remember that it must be consistent with the idea that God is an omni-being, that God is all-powerful, all-loving, and all-knowing. So for instance, you might be tempted to say that God allows death because it's better than overpopulation. But again, that's not going to be consistent with the idea of an omni-being. If God is really all-powerful, then God would be able to create us in such a way, create the world in such a way that it has limitless resources. And so they wouldn't have to choose between overpopulation on one hand and death and suffering on the other hand. So if an omni-being is allowing suffering, then that good gotten through the suffering must only be able to be obtained through that suffering. In other words, it's impossible to get that good without experiencing that suffering. Okay, so now we're going to look at three possible alternatives. So we have the appreciated goods defense, we have the character building defense, and then we have the free will defense. So now in the next three segments, we are going to look at each one of those. Let's talk about the appreciated goods defense. Without some suffering in the world, we wouldn't be able to appreciate the good things. The idea goes that, in a constant state of pleasure is just completely boring. If we have some contrast between the good and bad things, then we can appreciate the good things a lot better. This kind of life is a better life, because we can better appreciate the good things we have. And since an omni-being wants us to have our best life, then the omni-being allows this suffering to give us our best possible lives. So let's think about this. Is it possible for an omni-being to create us in such a way that we can experience the pleasure without stopping to appreciate it? Yeah, it seems like it. An omni-being could arrange us that way our pleasures keep increasing from moment to moment. That way we can constantly look back at the previous state of pleasure and appreciate that we are better off now. This suggests that there is no need for suffering to really appreciate the good things. So even if this argument were true, this defense were true, it's not clear that all of the suffering in the world is necessary. It seems like some of the suffering in the world is unnecessary. A little suffering can help us appreciate the good things, sure, but there does seem to be suffering in the world that doesn't really help us appreciate anything at all. In other words, there's suffering that's unnecessary. In light of this, we could revise our argument from suffering to, be a little bit more accurate. Not just suffering in general, but the specific pointless kind of suffering that we see. So here's the argument from pointless suffering. PS1, there is pointless suffering in the world. PS2, if there is pointless suffering in the world, then God does not exist. PS3, so God does not exist. PS1 here is a little bit more controversial than its counterpart, AS1. So less people would be inclined to agree that there's pointless suffering in the world. Nonetheless, it's still pretty plausible that there is pointless suffering in the world. And the idea behind PS2 is that an omni-being can allow suffering only if there is a good reason. However, by definition of the pointless suffering, there is no reason that the omni-being would allow that suffering in the world. So notice that the controversial premise here is flipped. So from the argument from suffering, AS1 was fairly uncontroversial. There's suffering in the world. But AS2 is slightly more controversial. Whereas PS1 and PS2, have flipped as well. So PS1 was pretty contentious. If there's suffering, then God would allow it. We're trying to find this, are there reasons why, God would allow the suffering? But PS2 is saying that there's pointless suffering that God is allowing, and that is pretty uncontroversial. Like, if there's pointless suffering, then, God is, not powerful or all-knowing or all-loving, so God's not an omni-being. Okay, so the point is that even if suffering is necessary for us to appreciate some of the good things, it's not clear that all suffering is necessary for us to, appreciate the good things in life. So another approach is to claim that there are only some character traits that can be acquired through some form of suffering. For instance, someone might claim that empathy, loyalty, perseverance, self-control, forgiveness, and trustworthiness are character traits that can only be gained in the face of adversity, failure, temptation, or some other form of suffering. The idea is that these traits are valuable enough to justify the suffering in the world. So this defense is going to push back against PS1, again, that there is pointless suffering in the world. This suffering might seem pointless, but it's actually there to help us build character. So the horrible, acts of war are necessary for people to develop courage. And since the world's a better place with courageous people, God allows there to be war. However, the character building defense does not really seem to be able to account for other instances. So, war also causes a lot of soldiers to have PTSD instead of making them courageous. So, there are a lot of things that war is doing more than just like creating courageous people or building their character. It's also like really destroying a lot of people's lives, things like that. So then there's this other thought, what if there's a prisoner who is, tortured and killed before that suffering allows them to build their character? Clearly, that kind of suffering seems pointless. There is no one who's benefiting from it. Maybe someone's family members are able to build their character by, having to take care of these people. Someone is, suffering from PTSD, but they come home and their wife becomes a more patient person because they have to deal with this soldier who, is suffering from this thing. And so the character that their partner develops is, justifying their suffering alone. That seems really kind of strange and inconsistent with the idea of an all-loving God, that they're going to use someone else's suffering to help someone else. Still, even if that is the case, we can imagine that there's one person out there who has no friends, who has no family, that is going to benefit from their suffering. And so all it takes is at least one person for the example for PS1 to be true, that there is some pointless suffering in the world. And so this character defense is probably not going to work. The free will defense is the idea that suffering is necessary for us to have free will. In a world in which we have free will and suffering is going to be better than a world in which we have neither free will nor suffering. So a world in which people are able to freely choose to do the right thing is superior to a world in which everyone is an automaton and we're only performing these kind and wholesome acts, but never doing so because we're freely choosing to do so. So this defense is able to account for more types of suffering, like torture and war. However, there are 3 reasons not to buy the free will defense here. First, this can only account for suffering caused by people. It cannot account for things like natural disasters, or dog bites, or cold weather. Second, the defense can not even account for all human-caused suffering. It seems like God would be able to allow us to generally have free will, but then also step in to avoid a genocide here or there. Analogously, a parent can allow their child to, live their lives freely, but every once in a while they might intervene to prevent the child from, causing some irreversible harm. They might step in and stop the child from walking off a cliff. So then finally, it's not clear that the idea of an omniscient being is even compatible with free will. The idea goes that, if God knows everything that's going on, then God knows everything that you're going to do. And if God knows everything that you're going to do, then you could not have acted otherwise. And if you couldn't have acted otherwise, then you can't have free will. So this is supposed to show us that the free will defense is just going to be a non-starter. Free will cannot explain why an omni-being would allow us to have suffering, since it's not even clear that an omni-being is consistent with the idea of us having free will. So far, all the reasons that an omni being might allow for suffering in the world have failed to identify some greater good that actually justifies the suffering. The theist might respond and say that, yeah, this totally makes sense. How could we, with our limited understandings of the world, be able to comprehend the reasoning of some omni-being? In other words, all of the alleged pointless suffering that we see in the world is not actually pointless. It's part of an omni-being's master plan. But this response isn't very satisfying. Maybe all of the suffering is part of an omni-being's master plan, and we can't be certain that it's not the case that all the pointless suffering is not actually an indispensable part of some magnificent plan that we can't even begin to imagine. However, just because we cannot be certain that there is no master plan does not give us really good justification for believing that there is a master plan. Instead, it seems more reasonable to conclude that at least some of the suffering that we see in the world is in fact pointless. Thus, we should affirm that there is no omni-being with a master plan. So to make this a little clearer, let's return to the thought experiment from the beginning of the video with Narnia. So remember, having seen all of the poverty, injustice, pollution, road hazards, corruption, inefficiencies, cruelty, etc., you laugh at the suggestion that the ruler of the country has limitless power, perfect compassion, and complete knowledge of everything that goes on in their country. Now, suppose that you're on a tour of Narnia and you're reminded that this is a very large country, most of which you have not seen. And the ruler is privy to classified information and has concerns and projects that you are just completely unaware of. And for all you know, the poverty, pollution, and so on are necessary parts of their master plan for creating the best possible country. So, reminded of all of this, should you now believe that the country has a ruler with unchecked power, limitless knowledge, and compassion? So I don't really think so. It doesn't seem reasonable to conclude that about Narnia, at least. So, by analogy, you shouldn't also conclude that there is an omni-being in this world with some master plan. So this argument can be formalized as the argument from disbelief. DB1, you should not believe that all the suffering in Narnia is necessary for some unknown greater good that the ruler has in mind. DB2, if you should not believe that all of the suffering in Narnia is necessary for some unknown greater good that the ruler has in mind, then you should not believe that all of the suffering in the actual world is necessary for some unknown greater good that God has in mind. DB3, so you should not believe that the suffering people endure in the actual world is necessary for some unknown greater good that God has in mind. DB1, the first premise here, seems pretty plausible. The only evidence that you have to support the idea that there's an omni-being in Narnia is the tour guide's word. But you also have all of the apparent suffering in Narnia to suggest that there is no omni-being. Hence, DB1, the first premise here, seems pretty plausible. DB2 is a premise, an analogous premise. The idea is that if Narnia and the actual world are relevantly analogous, as stipulated in the formation of the thought experiment, then any conclusion that you draw about one, you should also draw the same conclusion about the other. Now, you might reject that they are relevantly analogous, but again, this is like Narnia is just a thought experiment, so we could, slightly change Narnia to make it more relevantly analogous. So the idea behind DB2 is really just saying that, if we're going to conclude that there is no omni-being ruler in Narnia, then we should also conclude that there is no omni-being ruler in the actual world. Now, you can also think about it like this. All of the reasons that we've given for disbelieving in the omni-being ruler of Narnia, analogously, those same reasons are going to support disbelieving in an omni-being in the actual world. So this chapter argues that at least some sorts of suffering that we see in the world are not going to be consistent with an omni-being. Again, that's an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God. So we examined a number of possible, ways of making sense of, the suffering in the world and the existence of an omni-being, which usually involve pointing to one or another purposes that the suffering might be serving. But we found that all of these attempts cannot make sense of the full range of suffering that people endure in the world. So finally, this chapter argued that it's more reasonable to disbelieve in an omni-being than it is to believe that the suffering is all in service of some unknown greater good, that due to our limited perspectives, we are unable to identify. All right, so that is the argument from suffering and the chapter. I want you guys to think about the reflection questions before you guys come to class. So the first reflection question is it possible to escape these objections or escalate these objections by combining any one of the defenses? So we could think about combining the appreciated goods defense with the character building defense and or the free will defense. So the second question is that God is widely believed to reward people with eternal happiness in heaven. Could this possibly be turned into a response to the argument from suffering? Why or why not? And then one might respond to the argument from suffering or the argument from pointless suffering by insisting that God has to allow certain kinds of suffering for certain people because they deserve it in some sense. And God being all just, God has to give people what they deserve. So is this going to be an adequate response to the argument from suffering and pointless suffering? And finally, the last question I want you guys to be considering before class is, can the hidden reasons defense be objected against? So the objection in the previous segments, think about that. In particular, think about the connection between Narnia and the real world. Do you think that they're actually analogous, or do you think that maybe they're disanalogous? And maybe the hidden reasons defense works in one, but not in the other. All right, so that's all the notes I have on the argument from suffering and on this chapter. So think about these questions, reflect on what it is, and think like, are you actually convinced by this argument? Do you think that God does not exist because of the suffering in the world? You might think that God doesn't exist, but it's maybe for some other reason. But are you convinced by this argument in particular? That's what I want you guys to be thinking about, and I will see you in class.